Okay, welcome back. This is Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is an entire walkthrough of a project. It's a very small project, but that's okay. And it goes through all of the 10 domains and all the rest of the things. So it's actually a pretty decent chapter to give you an overview of what's coming. Okay, so let's start. The learning objectives on page 79. Let's just go through them to make sure we're going to be catching everything that we're supposed to catch. So, describe the 5 project management process groups, and then understand how those process groups relate to the body of knowledge things. Discuss how organizations develop information technology methodologies. And then review a case study, which we're going to spend a great deal of time on. And then we're going to do that same case study using a different methodology. And then talk about some templates on how you can make this a little easier. Okay, so to make this thing work, you really need to pause the video and read the case study on the next page. It's just a short paragraph, so hit pause now, read the thing, and when you're ready, come on back. Okay, so I assume you've read the case study now. So just to start off with, the project management processes are basically what they call integrative, which is a strange term. But what they're basically talking about is that actions taken at one step have effects on other steps. So when you do something here, it's going to have some profound impact a little later on. A definition of a process, kind of hokey, but give me a break. A series of actions directed towards a common result. Okay, I think you kind of already knew what a process was. All right, so the process groups on page 81. Basically, we're talking about 5 process groups. These terms should not be weird because we've covered them before. So, initiating a process, planning one, executing one, pardon me, monitoring and closing. So, we're going to go in a little bit more detail, but here we go. So, when you initiate a process, basically you're talking about I'm getting ready to crank something up, whatever that something is. And so one of the things, when you're talking about initiation from an entire project point of view, then you're talking about what is it we're trying to solve. What is this thing supposed to do? Typically during this initiation phase, you're trying to discover the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve. And by the way, when I say problem, I really don't mean it could be a negative thing you're trying to correct, or it could be a positive thing you're trying to exploit. So it's either a problem trying to solve or an opportunity you're trying to exploit, one of the two. But basically it's the same thing. Okay. So during this phase, you're probably going to determine whether or not you're going to do it. So there's going to be some sort of an authorization, and most likely you're not going to be the one who approves the project for to continue. You're probably going to have to pass it up and say, we recommend we're not going to do this, or we recommend we are going to do this. So some sort of an authorization typically takes place during that process group. The planning process. Planning is all about, I need to get down to figure out, how is this going to work? I know what the problem is. Okay, I've correctly identified the problem, but now what am I going to have to do to accomplish this goal? Is it going to accomplish the goal? And what am I going to have to do to pull that off? So there's an awful lot of plans that are created in this step, as you can probably imagine. There's a such and such plan and a such and such, over and over and over, all the different types of plans get created in the planning section. Wow, what a surprise, huh? And this is typically where you choose a methodology, and I'm going to hold off discussion what we're talking about until a little bit later. But when you're doing planning, you can say, I think this is a project that is so tried and true and been done so many times that we could afford to use this methodology. Or it could be, this is kind of weird, we've never done this before, I don't really know where we're going, so let's use this other methodology. So you usually pick that in the planning stage. Execution, that's pretty straightforward. That's when you do whatever it is you're supposed to do. So this is where you gather the resources, typically people and money, but it could be, suppliers and, I need hardware, I need software, but, acquiring the things you need to acquire. So this is where the resources come in. And obviously this is where you acquire or build or whatever it is you're doing. Monitoring. Monitoring is typically concurrent. This is not like the waterfall model. This is not like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. This is not at all like that. Monitoring is all about, let's make sure we're accomplishing what we said we're going to accomplish. So there's continuous monitoring all the way back to planning, execution. It doesn't, monitoring is not tacked on to the end. So this is where you measure your success, so to speak. And as I mentioned to you guys before, in my world, if you don't have a measurable goal, then your goal does not exist. You can't just make up something. You can't just say, well, I want to increase customer satisfaction. Okay, how are you going to measure it? I don't know. Well, if you can't measure it, that goal doesn't exist. Closing. Closing is when you get to the point where you have to come in and say, okay, we're done. So there has to be some sort of a final write-off, something that says, okay, we're done, and now we can get paid, if you're an outside contractor. Some sort of an acceptance report. And then you disperse the team. Now, these 5 process management groups need to be kind of mixed with all the steps you're going to be taking during the process. So, essentially what happens is a miniature version of these 5 things happens practically at all steps, all phases of a project. So in a particular phase of a project, you're going to be doing some planning, some execution, some monitoring. Then you go to the next phase, it'll be another initiating, planning, and so these things, maybe not all the time, but these things occur at practically all phases of a project. So how much time do you spend on these things? Well, this is one of those crazy things. Clearly, if you'd expect that execution's where the most of the amount of time is going to be, right? Come on, right? But if you're comparing yourself against, other project managers and really good project managers, what you're going to find is they're going to spend more time doing the planning part and less time doing the execution part. That kind of makes sense. The military always has these cool little phrases. Like, the more you sweat in training, the less you're going to bleed in combat. Those kind of hokey kind of sayings. But the idea is, the more you plan, the less you have to spend doing execution. So this is kind of a cool little chart showing, of course, execution is going to be the most amount of effort, but you really ought to consider doing a heck of a lot more planning than normal just to keep that down. Okay, one of the reasons that the planning part is so important is this is where you're going to come up with the project scope statement. This is where you're going to come up with those work breakdown structures, where you're going to come up with a project schedule. I mean, this is extraordinarily important part of the stuff. Before you start getting work, you need to know what it is you're doing. Kind of makes sense. Okay, I mentioned that these 5 things have a relationship with the body of knowledge areas, which we're getting ready to talk about next. So here's kind of a matrix. Now, I know this is like an eye chart, so just bear with me for a minute. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And if you can't see it, that's okay, because we can always look in the book. So here is those 5 things we just talked about: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and closing. And then here are the knowledge areas. So project integration. So let's just pick 1 or 2. So project integration management. So I'm going to develop a charter for the organization. I'm going to develop a management plan. I'm going to direct and manage work. I'm going to monitor and control. I'm going to close out the project. But then you go into things like time management. Okay, so this is a very important thing. So probably you're going to plan the schedule, right? And then you're going to control the schedule. You can kind of see how this works. Cost management, the same thing. I'm going to come up with a detailed cost estimate, and then I'm going to make sure I'm controlling the cost. Quality, I'm probably going to have a quality control plan, and I'm going to have to perform quality assurance, and then I'm going to do all the rest of these things. So I'm not going to read them all, but the point is that there's a mix-up. Anyway, there are 10 items in the program areas, and then the 5 things. By the way, the entire book is based upon chapters associated with this. So once we get past this chapter, we're going to have 1 chapter for each one of these guys. So this is how the book is built, all about these individual areas, the 10 knowledge areas. Okay, so continuing on page 86, they talk about the IT project management methodologies. So first of all, what the heck are they talking about? What is a methodology? Well, okay, a kind of a goofy definition of terms, but it's just how things should be done. So the methodology is well, here's the approach for doing this. A standard basically tells you what needs to be done. Okay, you need to build a house. Okay, and here's the methodology by which you're going to do that. Here's the technique you're going to use to obtain that standard. So what must be done versus how to go about doing it. So there's an awful lot of choices here. So let's just go through some of the choices. The first one they talk about is this thing called Projects in Controlled Environment, Prince 2. And this is basically the de facto standard for the UK and most of Europe. That's the technique they use for initiating projects. And it's a template. You can go to this website. You can go to prince.org and pull down the template, and it'll help you put together the phases of your project. And it's pretty cool. The other one is called Agile. I mentioned Agile before. We're going to do some Agile here. We're going to have an entire thing, a simulated environment where we're actually going to do it. But if you recall, there's two things that are kind of unique about Agile. One is it's the adaptive technique. Remember, we had predictive. If I could predict the future, I'll use this technique. If I can't predict the future, I'm going to use this other. Right? Okay, cool. So Agile is the adaptive development technique, and it also has an interesting thing in that it tends to produce multiple versions of something. So instead of having a long period of time with nothing and then presto you're done, in Agile you get version A, version B, version C, and then you get done. So you actually have 4 different versions of the same product by the time you're done. Of course, you typically throw away the old ones, but you get the point. Okay, so there's basically several sub-techniques under Agile. Agile is kind of an umbrella term. So several techniques under that. One is called extreme programming. And extreme programming, the hallmark of extreme programming is you work in teams of 2. Typically you have one person, maybe a senior person, and then a junior person working on a particular item. One person has got their head in the clouds and they're trying to look at the big picture. One person's detail oriented, trying to do just this one thing. So you have teams of 2, one with a high altitude view and one at a low altitude view of the same thing. And that supposedly is going to make for better products because no one can get lost in the details, or no one will be so caught up in the high level stuff that they don't do what needs to be done. Scrum is a term from rugby. If you're not a rugby fan, like I am not, I had never heard of Scrum before, but it's a technique they use on the field. But so they just kind of stole the term, and we're going to talk about Scrum here because the example that they use is using Scrum. Scrum is basically you huddle together, do your thing, come back, do it again and again and again. It's just a really tight cycle of doing something. There's one called feature driven, where basically you have a list of features that you're trying to accomplish, and you pursue those things one at a time. And there's a bunch of others. One called lean, and okay, I'm going to let you read the rest of these. So there is a problem with Agile, as I've kind of sort of mentioned before, and it's typically the issue you're going to have is with a traditional roles-based organization, with tight hierarchy and tight control. Those companies are going to feel a little squeamish when you say, when management says, how long is it going to take to do this project? And you go, I don't know. How much is it going to cost? I don't know. They kind of get nervous. So most of the problems with Agile kind of go away if the Agile staff is your own staff. If you have developers on your staff and you're paying their salary anyway, okay, then Agile works really great. However, if I'm hiring a consultant, a third party to come in and do it, and they're doing it with Agile and I don't really know how much it's going to cost, that would kind of freak me out. Okay, this is a good place to start for the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up again in just a few.